In this video, I'm going to teach you how to create your own SaaS application that uses AI to generate tree diagrams. If you're familiar with something like MindMap AI, this is the kind of tool we're going to create. In my opinion, this is such a cool use case for stitching both generative AI and no code together. Now look, there is so much that we need to cover here, so I'm going to hand this one over to Luca, and he's going to walk through everything you need to know.
Hello everybody, today we're going to be building a AI tree diagram generator. So if we say World War II powers, and as you can see, once we send that into our tree diagram generator, we have a nice tree diagram. So we've got World War II powers, Allied powers, go through all of these, Mexico, and then Axis powers. Perfect. So essentially what we'll be building is something similar to what these startups are all making a bunch of money off. And so what you're going to be learning in this video is function calls for OpenAI. And this is a really useful and important skill to learn if you want to build AI startups, especially with Bubble. So if we type in MindMap AI, for example, you can see that there's all these types of mind maps, and they all just generate these tree diagrams, which is essentially what we're going to be creating in this video here. So first of all, let's go to our checklist here. So initially we're going to build the UI, so the repeating groups, which is what we'll be propagating with ChatGPT, which are all these. And we're propagating them because we're making ChatGPT basically give us a JSON payload or a list in Bubble. So after we've created this UI, we're going to go in to the back end and really set up the ChatGPT integration. And then following that, we're going to do the actual workflows from Bubble. So just one simple action essentially that calls all of the APIs that we're set up in this section. And then we'll do some final tweaking to make it look a little bit nicer, as you can see here, for example. So the little lines and circles, etc. So let's jump into our editor here. And this is the one I made earlier. And as you can see, we've got one repeating group followed by a repeating group within that repeating group. And then within that repeating group, we've got another repeating group. So a bit of repeating group inception going on here, but it all makes sense after we've finished. So let's jump in and actually create a new page here called tree diagram 2, because this will be my second one called that. One thing to note for this tutorial is you'll need to have a paid account because we're going to be using back-end workflows which do require a paid Bubble subscription. And so yeah, just make sure you have at least a starter plan for this. So if we jump in to this one here, the first thing we're going to want to do is grab our first repeating group. So if we just drag and drop that onto our page, then if we click our page again, let's just make sure we're aligned to a column, and then we kind of want everything to line up in the middle. So let's hit the middle container alignment. To that, let's horizontally align the element, and now we're looking pretty good, I'd say. So just to keep the kind of UI very simple until we've made sure everything works at the end, what we're just going to do is add a piece of text in here, and that can be our way of basically having our nodes before we've actually structured the nodes out. So we just write trunk here, because this is going to be the top bit of our tree diagram. Perfect. And then essentially what we want is we actually want one row and one column. So that looks pretty good, except I'm going to uncheck make this a certain number of rows, and then we're just going to click 0 here. And then we're going to go to our layout and then make the height fit to the content and just make that 0 here. So now we've just got a kind of a smaller group and it's not just repeating itself over and over again. Perfect. So after that, what we're going to do is add in our second repeating group. And we can drag it into our first one here. Perfect. And on this one, we're going to want one row, but we don't know how many columns that the AI is going to generate. So we're going to want to uncheck set the fixed number of columns. And then just so we've got something to work with, we'll leave this at 40 for the time being. As you can see, we've got multiple columns here. And then we're going to go on to layout and then uncheck fit width to content so it expands out. And then I'm just going to center that as well. Let's go into the trunk text and center that. Perfect. So now I'm just going to copy and then paste the trunk and then drag this into our repeating group here. In fact, it might be a little bit easier to do it in the elements tree here. So if we get our second trunk and then hover over the second repeating group, perfect. And then we'll rename these just so we have a nice thing to look at, branches. Sweet. So while we're at this point, let's just go back and rename this the tree, repeating group tree, and then we can rename this one repeating group branches. And essentially we're going to have to do the same process all over again in the branches repeating group. So what I'm going to do to save us a little bit of time is just copy the branches repeating group, then click paste. We can now rename this to our sub branches. Perfect. Let's get into our text here. Call these sub branches as well. And then we can just drop these into our repeating group for those branches there. Lovely. So let's click our repeating group tree here and then also make it 0, except let's uncheck make the width fit to content because we want to make it expand fully. Let's go into our branches, make sure we've done the same. Yep, that's all good. And then sub branches, same again. And uncheck that. Fantastic. So now we've got the correct structure. We've got our main trunk, we've got our branches, and each branch has a bunch of sub branches, which is looking good. Now, the second thing we need is essentially to have our input form here. So this section. So if we go ahead and scroll down, we can grab an input and put that below our tree. Center it, add 20 margins on the top. And then the last thing we need is just a small button to trigger our workflow that we're going to be creating in just a second. So let's check how big this is, 250. So let's go in, make the minimum width 250. Let's add 10 pixels of margin on the top and then say, let's change the label to send. Perfect. Okie doke, we're looking pretty good now. I think we've pretty much created all of the different structural UI elements that we need for this tutorial, which is good within the button, repeating group, and the input. So we can take that off. Now it's time to probably do the most difficult part of this tutorial, which is the ChatGPT API integration with OpenAI. So first of all, you're going to want to go to plugins and make sure you've got the API connector from Bubble installed. Now, as you can see, I've got a bunch of API calls already, but if you've not used APIs before, you probably wouldn't have any. And essentially, all you need to do to get the API connector is just add a plugin and type in API connector. It'll be the first one that comes up, and as you can see, there's lots of apps that use it. So just hit install there, and then you'll be in a place where you can add another API, or add your first API, I should say. So if I add another API, we can create the OpenAI API from scratch here. So let's just name this OpenAI. The authentication method is private key and header. We're going to want to add another header. The key for that is going to be content dash type, and the value for that is application/JSON. So that's basically just telling the API what to expect in terms of the language that's coming. So it's JSON. Perfect. So now we actually need to have our key, which is basically your unique identifier that allows OpenAI to work out who you are, how many tokens you've used, etc. So to get that, what you're going to need to do is go to OpenAI, and then you want to click login. And once you're logged in, you don't need to have a paid account or anything. You might need to add a little bit of money into your API section. But basically all you need to do is go to dashboard here. So I spoke about money a second ago. What you might need to do is add a little bit of credit. But basically, I think there's a small usage limit, so you don't actually have to add any particularly. But if we go to API keys now, and you can click create new API key. Just call this one tree. And now we've got our API key that we can copy. So if we copy it here, what we need to do is go to our bubble editor, and then we can literally just type bearer space and then our API key. And that's just to basically tell OpenAI that this is the key that's coming. Bearer space and then your private key in there. Perfect. So now basically that's just sorting out the authentication and making sure that we can do any call we want from OpenAI. So you can basically have 20 calls. Now you've set this up and you don't have to configure your authentication again, which is really, really nice. So now we need to add our completions call, or the chat that's going to produce the JSON object that we're then going to plumb in to Bowl. So let's call this tree creation completions call. We're going to change this to action so we can have it in our workflows. We're going to change this to post. And essentially what the completions call is, a usual one is just this. We go to default here. It's just a string of messages between you and the AI itself. And so you just have the AI says something, you say something, the AI says something, you say something. This has just been sorted out, which is what we did 2 seconds ago. You can say the model, but what we're actually going to be doing is what's called functions here. And basically when the AI thinks that it should call a specific function that has been given, then it will basically extract information from your message to it and then create something in whatever format given it, basically. So on this one, the example is get weather. So the user content says, what's the weather today? So it calls this function. And it knows to do that because in the description of the function, it says get the weather, current weather in a given location. So it will extract Boston from this here, and then it will output the degrees Celsius, the city or state, San Francisco. And basically it will just say it is this weather in Boston today, basically. So how are we turning this into a tree diagram? Well, essentially a lot of fiddling around with ChatGPT. Without actually knowing how to code JSON itself, what I've done is basically created a schema that we can use. But if you can see here, it is a pretty fairly simple piece of JSON. So essentially, this is just the standard OpenAI configuration. You have a tool here. The type is function. The function name is generate tree diagram. So again, it knows to call this based on the name, but also the description. So if you're maybe working this into some sort of chatbot, you want to be quite specific with the name and the description. But for our purpose, it can just call it every single time. So we can be a little bit less rigorous in what we say here, but it's still quite important. And then you can see we have parameters. So this is what the function is going to output. Type object, so JSON object, and then we enter properties. Then we have the trunk, type string, which is this text, and then what it's going to output is the main topic of or name of the tree diagram. So this is giving the description of actually what to extract and what to generate based off the user's input. Now onto branches. Again, instead of it just being one thing or just an object, it's actually an array, so it's a list of things. The type of that is going to be object again, and each one, so it's going to be a list of title, strings, or the name of the branch, name or description of the branch, and then it's going to be the exact same thing for the sub branches. Now we'll have this in the description, so you can just copy and paste this into your editor to make it a lot simpler for you. But basically, if you want to get really, really good at function calling, it's probably a good idea to just completely learn how to code JSON altogether, which wouldn't take too long. It's a pretty simple schema. So if we copy this here, we're just going to paste it into our body section here. Now, as you can see, we've already got our dynamic input value here, and that's because if, for example, I get rid of these, this will disappear. What a greater than sign and a less than sign do is allow us to input a different value every single time, where if that wasn't there, it would just continually put input into the input box, which we didn't want. We've got GPT 3.5's turbo, and then we can just go down and make sure everything is correct, which I think it is. So let's give it a input type. So let's say cheese, uncheck private. And we've actually forgotten the endpoint URL here. So if we go back to the API, we just got to copy this. And this is essentially just the destination you're sending your payload to. So you're asking for a certain thing from the API, and you've got to go to a certain place to get it. And that's essentially what we're doing. This is the address of the letter, so to speak, of our API call. And then this is the actual content of the letter itself. So if we paste this in here, we can now initialize. Perfect. And we get our response back. Now, it's not actually called the function here. It says, hi, I can now generate a tree diagram related to cheese, yada, yada, yada. So to make it call the API, the function, every single time, we can change this to required. Initialize again, and you can see now it is called our functions here. So if we show the raw data, what we've got is an object here, and that's the return of the call. But we want the actual tree diagram here, which is in arguments, as an object like this, so we can use it in our workflows. But because it's within another object, we're not actually being able to grab that and use it as an object, which is just something to think about for the next API call we're gonna do. But for now, we can just save this. Perfect. And as I said before, we can now move on to actually making sure that our cheese tree diagram is recognized by Bubble as a JSON object instead of just a random string of text. So to do this, we're gonna go and grab our backend workflows here, and then we're gonna add a new workflow, new API workflow, and we can call this get underscore JSON. The next thing we're going to do is add a parameter. That's going to be the input, which is going to be our string of JSON, or the letters and numbers that we want to turn into JSON. We can leave that as text. That's perfect. Now within this API workflow, let's add another action, and the action is return data from API. If we go onto here and add other content type, we can now put that application /JSON into here, and then we want to grab our input, and that's basically adding that application JSON to object that's not being recognized yet, and that's essentially gonna get us to be able to recognize it as a JSON object. And if we go to plugins here, we want to be able to now call our backend workflow. So if we add another API, this is going to be our application, and then we can again call this or get our JSON. Now to actually call this backend workflow from the API connector, we're going to need to have again our endpoint, but we're also gonna again have to authenticate ourselves. And so to do that, we're going to need to go to settings, API. If you couldn't find backend workflows, this is where you would activate them in the API settings. I probably should have said that earlier. But once we're here, we can basically see our endpoint and we can see our private key. And so first of all, let's grab our private key here. And then we can go back to our plugins and again write bearer space and paste our private key in. And then if we go back, we can grab our root URL, which is our endpoint. And then we can paste that into here. Again, let's change it to post. But this will just be calling obviously our whole application. So to make sure it actually calls that backend workflow, all we need to do is go to our backend workflow, grab our name, which was just get JSON, and then we can just add a slash and paste that into there. And now that's going to call our backend workflow. So if we put action here, now we need to pass that input value to our backend workflow. So if we go curly brackets, input, and again, and then again, let's make it dynamic value. Then we can see if we can call this backend workflow. So if we go into here again and manually enter the response, it's going to be able to give us that API call. So we don't have to keep wasting credits. So if we copy that, save it, and then paste it into our value here and initialize, we're getting an error code. Now that error code, I think, is because we've got an issue with the way I've set this up here. So if I double check, so as you can see, our error code says unauthorized, which means something's going wrong with our authorization here. So if we have a look, we've actually got 2 spaces. So if we make sure there's just 1 space and then again initialize, we've also unauthorized, which is interesting. Again, let's initialize, perfect. Now you can see we've got our trunk, we've got a list of branches, and then we've got our sub branches within our branches. So if we see the raw data, we've got cheese, types of cheese production, cheese pairing, we've got cheddar, mozzarella, Swiss, blah, blah, blah. But basically we've got our JSON object here. As you can see, it's recognizing it in this bit, which is very important. So that's good. So we can save that. And now we can actually work on our workflows. So we've got our API keys, we've done our functions calling, we've done our backend workflow, and we've done an API call. So now we just need to do our button workflow here. So if we go to design, we've got our tree here, we can add a workflow on our button. And the first thing we want to do is call that OpenAI call. So if we go to plugins, you can see we've got our OpenAI tree creation completions call. Lovely. The input, we probably want to insert the dwelling data and put input A. Just don't want our SAS just to give people cheese ideas. So that's looking pretty good. Now after that, we're going to want to call our app, which is going to be our get our JSON. Perfect. Now instead of it just being this, it's actually going to be our argument from here. So our JSON object that was within our API call. So if we go to the result of step 1, it's going to be choices, scroll down, our tool calls, and our arguments. Let me just do first item. Perfect. Now for this to work properly, what we actually want is to make sure it never includes something that might invalidate our code. So for example, if we go into our code here, if I delete this, for example, you can see it's thrown out all these other sections of code. So we want to make sure it's safe. The thing we're passing from our call to OpenAI into our app, which is going to try and recognize it as JSON, we need to make sure that all that is completely safe. And what that is basically called is escaping JSON. And Bubble gives us a really nice tool to do that, and it's called JSON safe. So format as a JSON safe. But what that JSON safe also does is put it in the quotation marks automatically. So to make sure our call still runs, because for example, if we did this, which is essentially what we're doing, you can see it doesn't run. What we want to do is go to our app API call. We want to delete the quotation marks and then just reinitialize it with the quotations added into the input, just so we can get the call running. Obviously for subsequent calls, it will be the JSON safe operator that's going to do this for us, but just to initialize it, we can do it this way. Perfect. So now it's definitely going to be JSON safe, which is great. And now we need to plumb this data into our tree diagram. So let's do display a list in a repeating group. It's automatically gone to our tree, and the data source is going to be the result of step 2. Perfect. Now it's red just because we've not actually set the type of data of this repeating group yet, as you can see here. So if we set it and go down all the way down, you can see that we've now got get our JSON, and we've got our get our JSON branch. But for this one, let's just do get our JSON. Now going back to the workflow. So as you can see, we've got a bit of an issue. Our dynamic data here is not working. That's because we're trying to plug in one tree into a repeating group where it's expecting many trees, which is actually an error in our initial design of the UI. So if we actually right click onto the repeating group here, and because we don't need loads and loads of trees, you could obviously create one that creates multiple trees. But for this tutorial, we're not going to do that. So if we actually convert it, or replace the element type, and convert it into a group. Now, if we go to our workflow, you can see that it's also not working because this repeat group doesn't exist anymore. So instead of now displaying this data in the repeating group, which we just deleted, we can now display it in a group, which is just what we've turned our repeating group into. And then that group is called group tree here. And then if we go to that group and then make sure it's get our JSON here, go to our workflows. Now when we display the result of step 2, we've got it blue, which is perfect, which means it's working. And so now we can rename the trunk here. So if we go in and insert some dynamic data, it's going to be parent group trunk. Perfect. Now our first repeating group, what we want to actually set the type of content to is, you can see we have get our JSON branch, and that's going to be parent groups get our JSON's branches. So it's going to be basically the tree of this group, which we've just put in, or we've just displayed that data. And again, if we go into the branches, we can do the current sales branch, its title. Perfect. Then with the sub branches, we do their repeating group. What we actually want to change this to is just text, because the sub branches information is text, and so each branch has then just a list of text, which is the sub branches. And so we can go to this data source, sub branches, perfect, and then we can go to the text of the sub branch, insert dynamic data, current sales text. So because essentially the sub-branches don't contain another group, they're not actually their own data type, they're just a list of text. And so that's why we've done it that way. But in terms of the data, we're all ready to go here. So let's preview our application and see if it's working, albeit a little bit not pretty. So let's do pizza. Lovely, we've got ingredients, cheese, tomato, dough, toppings, blah, blah, blah. But essentially we've generated that perfectly. So now let's actually make it look like the previous one. Let's make it look nice for our users. So if we go in here, we probably want to keep this pretty similar because it's lining up nicely in the center of the page. But what we will do is we'll right click, group the element in a row. We'll go to layout, make it fit the width and the height, which is already done. We're going to change this to 0, however. And then what we're going to do is just add padding. We'll do 10 on the top, 10 on the bottom, and then 20 on the left, 20 on the right. Lovely. And then we're going to go in and then add a background to this, make it a flat color, and then let's do a red, a light red like this. What we could do to make it a little bit more uniform is make sure it is 100% red and then just add 10 for the opacity. That's looking a lot better, but let's change the roundness to 10. Okay, nice, that looks pretty good. So now we don't want our line and our little node. So what I'm going to do for that is literally just add a shape in. We can then drag it in here. I'm going to center it, make the width maybe in 5, nice. And then we can make the height 60 maybe, lovely. I'm just going to change this to grey instead of yellow because I feel like yellow is just a little bit of a weird colour. What I like to do for grey is kind of making it just black and then changing the opacity, because that can give you a more uniform type of grey, and instead of trying to pick out the exact position of the grey or remembering the hex code, you can just do black 20%, 10%, etc. And it'll be the same grey every single time. So we've got a stick here, which is looking pretty good. I'm gonna uncheck roundness, so it's just completely square, which looks a bit better. And then I'm gonna copy and paste our shape. If we do width for 10, height 10, in fact, let's do 20. Lovely, and then we can go to roundness for this one and do 100. And now we've got our nice looking nodey thing. And essentially what we're going to be doing is almost exactly the same for the branch. So if we click onto our branch title again, column, I'm going to check 0 height and width, padding 10, 10, 20, 20. Lovely. Roundness 10. Background style, flat color. Let's maybe do green for this one. So I'm just gonna click green all the way. Then 10%. And that's looking pretty good, except we're gonna want our shape here. So what I'm gonna do is just click our first shape, hold shift, click our second shape, click copy, and then in our element tree, I'm gonna click on our repeating group and then just hit Control V, and that pastes that into our repeating group. And while they're both selected, we can go to layout, hit previous, which is gonna put it in the column of the repeating group before our sub branches, which is looking pretty good again. And now let's format our sub branches. So literally exactly the same again. I'll fast forward this section because it's probably getting a little bit dull. Perfect. And we don't actually need another node because we don't have another layer, which is looking pretty good. What I do want to do though is I do now want to make it, actually no I don't, I want to keep it fit with content unchecked, but what I do want to do is add in our cross branches here. So we could do it like this, but then what would happen is we don't have our connecting branches. So to create our connecting branches, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this shape here and paste it, and I'm going to click our shape and our group and then put them in a row. Nice. Now we're going to again make all of the height and width 0 so it zooms in, but instead of it being the width, we basically want to turn this like that. So to do that, what we're going to do is just turn this to 60 or 30 and then make the height 5. And the vertical alignment, let's put it in the center of this row here, which is pretty good. Now we're going to copy and paste that and then hit previous a couple times, and then we're going to want to have one for this side as well. That looks pretty good. And so if we left it like this, it would look pretty good. We'd have our connections here. But for the first one, we have this weird sticky out connection bit which doesn't connect to anything, which we don't really want. So if we add a conditional rule here, we can say that when the current cell's index is 1, so when the current cell's index is 1, what we're going to do is we're going to change the background color. And instead of it being 10, we're just going to make it 0. So you can't actually see it all, like so. And that's because if we got rid of it completely and we made it, when we collapsed it when it's hidden, then our node would shift to one side, because this would be trying to be as big as it could be. So with this, and this wouldn't be here, so it would kind of slam it. 50% of this column would be taken up by this, and by this. Which, having said that, we need to go to layout and then uncheck, make it fixed width, so it does expand. And then we're going to want to do the same for this one, because equally the same problem with the first group is going to be the same one with the last group. So again, if we go into here, so for the last one, it's going to be slightly different because we're not going to know exactly how many branches there are in the tree. And so what we can do is say when the repeating group's branches, list of branches, is last item, so the last branch essentially is title, is the parent group's title. So when basically they're the same thing, then we can then change the background color to 0. Lovely. And now what we want to basically do is copy both of these, go to our repeating group here and paste them both in, because we want our connections between our sub branches as well. Now while they're selected, I'm going to select that group and then hit row, so they're all in a row. Our first one here, we can move to the other side, which is looking pretty good, except no, that's our first one. So let's move this one over and this one to right again. Now instead of it being the branches list, it's going to be the repeating group sub branches. When the list of text last item is parent group's text. So when in the list of text, which is sub branches, when the last item's text is the current cell's text, so when they're the same, we then hide the color. Perfect. So now it's looking nearly 100% there, except what I do want to do, I just want to add a little bit of separations between the level. So I'm just going to add 10 pixels on the bottom here and there. And then I'm going to go to our repeating group. I'm going to change the style of the separators to none, and the border of each box to none, and then do the same thing with our other repeating group. So the style of the separators to none, and the style of the borders to none as well. Okay, cool. So the tweaking now looks pretty good. Now let's preview it and see if it's looking how we want it to look. Let's do pasta. For me, it's getting pretty close to tea time, as you can probably imagine. Lovely. So now we've got our groups. It's not appearing here or there or there or there or there or there. It's looking pretty good. Each one of our things is within a nice looking box. And yeah, it all looks pretty good. The only thing that is a little bit strange for our users is this is here where nothing's been generated. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our group, we're going to go to layout, we're going to uncheck this element visible on page load, we're going to collapse it when it's hidden. We can animate our collapse operation, why not? Let's slide up and down, cool. And then we're going to say when this group get JSON trunk is not empty. So when there's actually data in this group, we could have chosen, branches or anything, or we're just basically saying by choosing the trunk that when it is populated with data, then this element is visible. And so we should get our animation as well. So let's go in and have a look. And let's do cake. Click send. Lovely. We've got types of cake. We didn't have anything before, as we can see. This is really nice and central. Perfect. So one thing to note before we finish is that if you wanted to maybe make this a lot more detailed, etc., what you would need to do is basically go into our ChatGPT completions call, and then you would just say, make this super long, make this about this many words, or so this is basically where you give a direction on the level of detail you want in each one of your nodes. But I think that is pretty much the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Yeah, it's used a lot of different APIs. It was a pretty advanced one, but I'm sure if you can get a hang of this, you can kind of build whatever you want using AI. So probably quite an important one if you're a startup founder. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know what other video suggestions or other things you want us to cover in the comment section. And as I say, all the calls and other information should be in the description. So yeah, have a good one.
And just like that, you now know how to integrate AI with your Bubble app to generate custom tree diagrams. If you found this video useful and you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources we share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button in my channel so that way you can be the first to know whenever we drop a new tutorial. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this specific video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.